Okay, so I was asked by the organizers to give a little overview of SCSquared at the start of my talk. So that's what I'm going to do. And then I'll talk a little bit about my recent work with machine learning. And I acknowledge the EPSRC, who currently support my, my work in this area. So SCSquared, then, I think probably everyone in this room knows what it stands for, but just in case, or if there's anyone watching the video later, let's define it. So it's formed by two abbreviations, which are both SC. So one of them is Satisfiability checking. That's the community of computer scientists who are interested in algorithms to check the satisfiability of logic problems with variables from a variety of domains. And they tend to implement their work in what are called SAT-solvers or SMT-solvers. And then the other SC is the Symbolic Computation community, who are another group of computer scientists and mathematicians who are interested in algorithms to perform algebraic computations, such as polynomial computations, for example. And they tend to historically implement their work in computer algebra systems. And so the SCSquared community is people who are interested in both of these SCs, which hopefully includes all of the people listening to this. So this slide was borrowed from Erica Abraham in her ISAC 2015 paper. Just gives a nice kind of overview of the development of these two communities. I won't go through the slide in detail, but we can see a couple of things here. So first of all, you can see the computer algebra community has a slightly longer history, but the SAT community more than made up for this in the last few decades with lots of progress. And the other thing we can notice is these two communities are quite separate. These systems tend to be dedicated to one or the other. And until at least the last decade, these two communities didn't really interact so much. So why should they interact? Well, I guess one way to think about that is to define what SMT stands for. I used that abbreviation earlier. So it stands for Satisfiability Modulo Theories. It refers to a SAT problem in computational logic where the atoms of the formula whose satisfiability we're trying to check need not be Boolean variables. They could instead be predicates, things that evaluate to a Boolean, which involve variables from other domains. Now, these domains could be mathematical ones. They could also be more kind of data structures or uninterpreted functions. So a common framework for dealing with these problems is to separate out the reasoning in the logic from the reasoning in the theory, and to use the SAT solver algorithms and implementations to search through the logic space, and then use some kind of specialist algorithm or software from the domain of interest to deal with the reasoning in the theory. And for not all of the theories, but for a lot of them, the domain of interest has traditionally been studied by the symbolic computation community. And so there's a motivation there for the SMT people to learn about symbolic computation. And of course, there's motivation in the opposite direction as well. The integration of SAT solvers into computer algebra systems can allow these tools to offer much more powerful reasoning. So what kind of successors has the SCSquared community had to date? Well, I'll start by mentioning the fact that the community won an EU project, which is where the name SCSquared comes from. This was funded by the EU from 2016 to 2018. The aim of the project was to bridge the gap between these communities. It was a slightly odd grant because the main aim wasn't necessarily new research, but rather new individuals, people who could combine the knowledge and techniques of both of these fields and be, members of both communities. So the project did a variety of things. It funded a variety of collaborations and tool integrations, came up with proposals to extend the SMT lib language standards to better support the domains of interest, new collections of benchmarks, and importantly, it funded 2 summer schools and also this workshop series that our session today is part of. Although that project finished in 2018, the workshop series has continued after it. and the website and mailing lists for SCSquare do remain active. And one thing, a particular success I'd like to point out is volume 100 of the Journal of Symbolic Computation was an SCSquare themed special issue published last year. So the workshop series has been in its 6th edition today. Started off in 2016 in Romania and continued through Kaiserslautern, Oxford, Bern. The last 2 years it's been online. And it's taken place usually as part of an established conference, tends to alternate between conferences of computer algebra and computer logic. So this year with CIAM AG, we're on the algebra side of things. But next year we should be continuing alongside a logic conference. It's worth noting that only the first 3 of these were funded by the EU. So this has continued due to interest in the community. And I'm pleased to say there is some funding obtained to support it, at least for the next 2 years. So it should continue. Okay, so I wanted to highlight what I think are some of the most interesting successors of SCSquared. And I'm using SCSquared here to mean the broader area of research that involves both of these SCs, not exclusively research of the EU project. And I'll talk about, first of all, the research that's closest to me, which is in nonlinear real arithmetic, which is another way of saying working with systems of nonlinear polynomials, assign constraints on them. So this is a core topic for symbolic computation, but also it's important for SMT, for dealing with problems in the NRA, and that's nonlinear real arithmetic, or quantifier-free nonlinear real arithmetic logics. And this has been one of the areas where we've seen the most SCSquared connections. So I guess the earliest one would be the NLSAT algorithm from 2012, which repurposed a lot of the theory of cylindrical algebraic decomposition, originally by Collins in 1975, and until then implemented in computer algebra systems. And it was repurposed for the NRA problem. This is not simply re-implemented. This is really a new algorithm that used some of the same theorems to justify its correctness. But the NLSAT algorithm does not produce cylindrical algebraic decompositions. Rather, it uses some of that theory to help search for satisfiable solutions. Another one that I really wanted to flag up is the SMT Wrap Toolbox, developed at RWTH Aachen. And this has implementations of a wide variety of computer algebra tools, not just cylindrical algebraic decomposition and NLSAT, but lots of other things as well, Grobner bases, for example. And these, again, are not simple re-implementations, but these algorithms are adapted for the SMT community purpose, so for the purpose of searching for satisfiability. So what does that tend to mean? Well, it means that these algorithms need to be made to work incrementally by constraints, because the search through the SAT space tends to study subsets of the polynomial constraints at a time and ask the theory algorithms to check whether those subsets can be satisfied together or not. And of course, that could lead to repetition of work if one doesn't build an incremental implementation. The other key difference to the traditional computer algebra implementations is the need to provide conflicting cause or some kind of explanations for when constraints can't be satisfied at the same time. So more recently, there's been, post the EU projects, a number of developments along this topic. So one that I've been involved in is the conflict-driven cylindrical algebraic coverings algorithm, joint with Aachen and Bath, which again repurposes CAD technology, a bit like NLSAT. Like NLSAT, it doesn't produce decompositions, it instead produces coverings sufficient for fielding a search for satisfiability. But unlike NLSAT, it's a single algebraic procedure that can be used as a module in the DPLLT framework. A different algorithm inspired by NLSAT is the NuCAD algorithm by Chris Brown. That stands for non-uniformly cylindrical algebraic decomposition. So this is a decomposition, unlike NLSAT, but unlike NLSAT and CD-CAC, this does not use the strong cylindrical property. It constructs one cell at a time using local information, which allows for optimizations. And unlike NLSAT, it can be used for the stronger problem of quantifier elimination. A couple of other SC² developments in this area I should like to mention. The combination of computer algebra system Redlock with SMT solver Verity, which did very well back a couple of years ago when submitted for the SMT competitions, and the incremental linearization techniques of Kimati et al., which again offered very excellent performance on the competitions. So moving away from nonlinear real arithmetic, other SC² successors I'd like to mention. First of all, on the computer algebra side, Maple, very popular computer algebra system, can now read to and from SMT-lib, and now ships with both the SMT-solvers Z3 and MapleSat. The Cocoa lib is a C++ library that underpins the Cocoa computer algebra system, but is separate to that system and can be used independently of it, and has been used by the SMT-solvers MathSat and SMT Wrap. And another system I'd like to mention is the Math Check system, which is, uses a combination of computer algebra and SAT solvers to make progress on check and verify combinatorics problems. And it's been applied to a variety of different combinatorics problems in the last few years. I'll give you some of the references there. What else? Well, if we retract a little bit back to the Boolean SAT problem, there's been some work presented in the SC² workshops on the use of Boolean Grobner bases, computer algebra technique in parallel with Boolean SAT, moving solutions between the two forms in order to further the search in each. And also in the Boolean area, circuit verification is an application that's seen a lot of work with algebraic techniques in combination with SAT solvers. Some of that presented at the SC² workshop as well. There's also been some work on natural style proofs and a variety of new applications of these technologies, such as in economics, in dynamical geometry software, knot theory, to name just a few. So that was just a little whirlwind tour of SC² for anyone who's not so familiar with the workshop. I do apologize if I left out work that you think should be classified as a past success. That was by no means a comprehensive summary. So I'll now turn to one of my recent interests. I just realized though I have somewhat lost track of time, so it's now 5:02, so I've got 10 more minutes. Is that right? One of the chairs? I think that's right. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about this and how it links to SC². So I'm sure everyone's heard of the term machine learning, but let's just put a definition on it in case. So machine learning tools are algorithms and tools that use statistics and large quantities of data to learn how to perform tasks that are not explicitly programmed. So they offer probabilistic guidance. And in recent years, these tools have had a wide variety of successors in all kinds of areas of science technology. And they power many of what we call artificial intelligence advances that we're familiar with today, such as image recognition, natural language processing, and so on. But these tools are really tools that offer probabilistic guidance. That is to say, they give you an answer, but with good probability that answer is correct, but it's not guaranteed to be correct. And both of the SC communities, computational algebra, computational logic, produce software that prizes exact results. We want to know exactly the right answer and be confident in the answer that our software gives. So is there really interest for SC² of machine learning? So I would say yes. First of all, machine learning techniques can be used to make non-critical choices. So for example, guiding searches. If your algorithm has to search through a large search space, then we could perhaps use machine learning to inform us where to search first. Now, if the machine learning was right, we find what we're looking for quicker. If the machine learning's wrong, well, that's a shame, but we will just mean that our search is slower. It doesn't invalidate the result of our search. So used this way, machine learning has no effect on the validity of our software, but it can make a huge contribution to computational efficiency, and also, especially in the algebra side of things, the presentation of the end result. Mathematical quantities and objects can often be described in many different ways. Some ways are better, simpler than others, and so it can also offer benefit there. So at the moment in computer algebra systems, a lot of these kind of choices are made by the user or the developer, kind of as a side argument to the algorithm. In the SMT side, they tend to be a little more technical than that, but they still tend to be human-made heuristics to help guide these searches. And I guess my thesis here is that machine learning could do that better. But I'd like to really kind of distinguish this from another body of research that's over the last few years has been gaining traction, such as the work coming out of Facebook, like the Lampel and Charlton paper, and that's using machine learning to directly predict the end results of mathematical processes. The one I've cited here was predicting symbolic integration and the solution to ordinary differential equations. And there's been a variety of papers that have followed on other maths problems. So this is a different idea, not discrediting that idea, but it's less of interest to our communities, because even though that Facebook paper was able to achieve 98% accuracy, I think most computer algebra systems will be quite worried about the other 2% that wasn't accurate. So what kind of examples of the things I'm talking about are there in the literature? Well, I've just selected a few here. Probably the most famous is the first one from the SAT community, the SATzilla kind of solver back in 2008. It was essentially a SAT solver, which was just a machine learning classifier to choose which of the previous year's SAT solvers to use for a particular problem instance, and it did very well. More recently, there's work on machine learning for branching heuristics in SAT solvers, and I think that's going to be the topic of our next talk, or at least one of them. So I won't say too much about it now. Another interesting one I saw recently by Wu here was the use of a model to predict the satisfiability of formulae after fixing some of their variables for the purpose of selecting good initial variables, good start for the search. What about on the algebra side of things? Well, the earliest paper I could find on the algebra side of things involved a Monte Carlo tree search, which you could argue is machine learning to an extent anyway, to find the representation of polynomials that were most efficient to evaluate in a computer algebra system dedicated to particle physics. We've also got just selected one of my papers here, the use of support vector machines to decide whether or not to precondition CAD. And more recently, last year, Brown and Davis use a neural network to select the order of constraints that new CAD algorithm I mentioned earlier should process the constraints in. So that's an example here that the algorithm could process the constraints in any ordering. It's perfectly valid to do so in any ordering, but in some orderings it will be quicker than others. So I'll finish my talk now with a few words on my own work in this area. So my work is to do with this cylindrical algebraic decomposition algorithm, which I don't have time to define in detail, but I'll give a pictorial explanation here. So basically, it's a decomposition of a real space produced from a set of polynomials such that each polynomial has invariant sign on each cell. So the picture on the slide here is for the polynomial x squared plus bx plus 1, where b is the horizontal axis, x the vertical axis, and the different colored regions you see there are the different cells that a CAD would produce. The black dots that you see on the picture are sample points. There's one sample point for each cell, and I guess the power of CAD is that it allows you to make a finite number of samples of your space and from them infer all of the information that you need. So one application of CAD is quantifier elimination. So for example, here I'm using that polynomial as part of a quantified problem, and I want to find a quantifier-free analog to that mathematical statement. So I could build my CAD, tag each of my cells true or false for the statement just by testing the sample point, substituting it in, seeing if it's true or false. And then where I have true cells are the values of B for which there does exist such an X. And so here I get my quantifier-free statement coming out. Of course, quantifier elimination has within it satisfiability as a subproblem. So what is it that I've been using machine learning for? Well, one of the things you have to do when building a CAD is to choose a variable ordering. And this is really important. So CAD is doubly exponential complexity in the number of variables. And this complexity is really felt in practice, not just a theoretical thing, but with careful optimizations and manual pre-processing and kind of manual tricks, you can really push back that doubly exponential wall and bring problems into scope. And a particularly important optimization is that variable ordering. So for quantifier elimination, you do have to order the variables in the order they're quantified, but there's no restriction on free variables, and adjacent quantifiers of the same type may be swapped. So we have this choice here that needs to be made, and it can dramatically affect the number of cells in the CAD and the time to compute them. So here's a kind of trivial example where I've got a simple polynomial, linear in Y. So it's just a curve that turns up and down. So if I look at it in this variable ordering, it's just 3 cells above the curve, below the curve, and the curve itself. But if I was to make the mistake of looking at it in the other variable ordering, I end up with 59 cells. And okay, so there's been a number of heuristics designed by humans for this. I'm not going to go through them all now, but I'll just say none of them are perfect. And then back in 2014, I worked with Zongyang Huang, a PhD student, and she applied a support vector machine to choose which of these heuristics the CAD should follow. And her experiment showed that doing that was better than following any one of those heuristics, a bit like the SATzilla solver I mentioned earlier. And we came back to this in the last few years. So I was funded by the EPSRC 2018 to 2020 to look at in more detail the use of machine learning for this problem. So together with my colleague Dorian Florescu, we looked at a variety of machine learning classifiers for this problem. We looked at different ways to generate features to feed into the machine learning. So you can't just feed the polynomials directly into machine learning, or at least perhaps not a good idea. Instead, we want to try and identify key algebraic features of these. So we came up with some new ways to do that. And then another thing we looked at was how to define what it means to be accurate in this context. So with machine learning classification, usually you're seeking the optimal class from a selection of classes, but that's not really quite appropriate for this problem because the second best ordering may be just a fraction more expensive than the best ordering, but we don't want to treat that the same as the worst ordering. So we looked at ways to adapt the training, and in particular the hyperparameter section to this. And we finished the project by releasing everything in our software pipeline as a free Zenodo repository. So if you're interested, these slides are on my website, and you can find all the references there. Just to get to the headlines, I know I'm running out of time here. So on our free variable data sets, the best of the human-made heuristics achieved times 27% above the minimum, whereas machine learning achieved times 6% above the minimum. On the 4 variable data set, the human heuristic achieved times on average 98% above the minimum, machine learning 67% above. So still a lot of work to do in getting to the actual minimum here. So what kind of challenges do we have here? Well, dealing with the exponential growth in the number of choices. So what's one of the reasons why the results for the 4-variable data set are not as good as for the 3-variable data set, because with 3-variable data set, I'm choosing between 6 variable orderings. Here, we're choosing between 24, I guess. But more importantly, I think for machine learning, it's about finding data sets that are sufficiently varied and really representative of all the use cases. So what happens when you give these machine learning tools examples that are very different to the ones they're trained on? And then essentially what we're working on now is using deep learning to do this. And then the question is how to generate in a meaningful way data sets that are large enough to do that. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I'm happy to answer any questions, but that's where I'll finish my talk. So thank you for listening, and just to advertise that Coventry University do have a fully funded PhD position open to work on the topic of machine learning and computer algebra, specifically looking at symbolic integration and symbolic simplification. This is a position sponsored by the software company MapleSoft. Deadline to apply is mid-September for a start in January 2022. And if you happen to know any good students who have just finished their degree, might be interested in this PhD position, I'd be grateful if you could tell them about it, or just ask them to get in contact with me. I'd be happy to talk to them further. So I think I'm done.
Thanks very much, Matthew. So we've got a few minutes for questions if someone wants to put their hands up, their virtual hands up. I don't see any here. Baptiste, pardon. Baptiste,
yeah,
please.
it's me actually. So I was asking myself, was there's any chance to get heuristics that human could understand from machine learning? So what from your machine learning experiments you could do some reverse engineering and understand what's going on there?
So that's a really great question. It's something we're also really interested in. I mean, during that project that I mentioned, we did do a couple of experiments in that direction, looking at decision trees and trying to really restrict the amount of branching in the tree to try and get something that was comparable to a human designed heuristic. And I would say that didn't really give me anything that I felt was particularly human understandable. We also, in our feature selection work, when I talked about new features we derive, we spent a lot of time trying to analyze what the best subsets of features were, and I think we did get something there that was a bit more human understandable. There were some details of that in the paper, but I think this is a really crucial question, and we're doing some work now looking at really restricted neural networks, so neural networks, but really with not too much going on by the standards of neural networks anyway, in order to try and see if we can derive something a bit more human understandable with that. But we're not yet finished with that work. But I think it is a really important goal, and it's always what I originally wanted when I started this project. But I wouldn't say that we're really there yet. But thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you for the answer.
Yes. A good question. Just to comment that Mike Stillman had a paper on machine learning and growth bases where he did seem to find a human understandable feature. So it's worth thinking about, certainly.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everyone.